to welcome you today to our seminar. We have a very special guest from the Information and Privacy Commissioner office in Ontario. But before we start that talk, I'd like to bring your attention to a couple of details. You may have seen several colorful flyers outside on our display table. Bright pink one, it matches my...
No, it doesn't. It clashes. Move
it sorry. This will be a panel seminar of experts covering a series of, or several sectors of interest on smarter health in the health sector. We'll have experts coming from industry, from academia, from the hospital setting, and they will continue our exploration and bring some closure to what we've discussed over the past year in terms of information technology in the healthcare system. So I invite you to come to that seminar on June 19th, next month. It is also our pleasure to announce the 2002 recipients of the J.W. Gray Medal. Peter Savage will be the recipient this year, and he will give his medal seminar presentation on June the 14th. That's Friday afternoon. It will be here at 2:30, and we'd welcome you all to what I think will be a very entertaining talk, at least from the abstract that he has given us. Pardon me? Trapped in Silicon Valley during the Grand Chase. Peter has a very interesting academic background as well as a career in business. He started out at the University of Waterloo, got both BMath and a Master's of Mathematics. Went on and did his law degree at Stanford, then went into business and went through a rapid succession of businesses. And I guess he's going to reflect on all of that. All within a space of what, about 15 years, 14 years? So, and those of you who have been at Waterloo, you may recognize his name. He was one of our star basketball players in the 1980s. As well, I'd like to announce that Mr. John Chen, who is the chairman of the board, president and CEO of Sybase, will speak to us on June the 6th in a room right across the corridor, 1350, at 4 o'clock. And he will be talking on the journey of a successful high-tech businessman. So those are our upcoming events. In addition to that, I'd like to make you aware that over the past year we have been videotaping our seminars. Most of those seminar videotapes are now available on our website. So that's internet.urlu.ca. And if you happen to miss one or two of our seminars, please go to our website and you'll be able to view them there. So without any further ado, David, would you introduce our speaker?
With pleasure, Shirley. It's my great pleasure to introduce Greg Keeling from the Ontario Information and Privacy Commission today on a topic that really is at the very center of our interest as a society with the use of technology and the challenges and opportunities of technology and privacy in healthcare. Greg is very well qualified to speak on this subject. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the Ontario Privacy and Information Commission, manages several departments and coordinates agency-wide planning initiatives in that area in the Ontario government. Greg has served in other areas of the Ontario government, principally with the Management Board Secretariat. If you look at his lapel, you'll see red, blue, and yellow, Queen's colors. He has 3 degrees or certificates from 2 wonderful institutions, Queen's University and the University of Toronto. And he is a very important person in one of the truly important privacy commissions in the world. By and large, Canadian history of privacy and freedom of information stands at the head of the list or towards the head of the list of jurisdictions around the world, and the lead jurisdiction in many people's minds in Canada would be Ontario. Greg, we're delighted to have you with us today. We look forward to your leading this discussion on a topic that is very central to our concerns here at the University of Waterloo and certainly the concerns of Canadians and people around the world. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, and thank you for having me, both because it's always nice to get out of Toronto, but mainly because you're interested in hearing these important issues. I should start with one caveat and two apologies. One, the caveat, I am neither a lawyer nor a health policy expert, so you can't ask me any tough questions in those issues. And the two apologies, one, I'm sorry that my presentation is so long, but there's just an awful lot to cover, and to do it justice, I sort of have to death by PowerPoint. And the other apology is I'm sorry that it's too short. I've only got 45 minutes and not 4.5 hours to really do it justice. But we will get through as we can. Just so people know what the IPC is, because most people have really never had any dealings with us. Our mandate, we are an independent oversight tribunal, which means the commissioner is an officer of the legislature, much like the chief elections officer, the auditor, that sort of thing, the ombudsman. And the commissioner reports to the Legislative Assembly directly, not through ministry, to ensure her independence and neutrality. The two issues that are fundamental are access to government information, which ensures an open and accountable and transparent government, and the protection of privacy, meaning that the information that the public has given to government remains protected. These are, as you can see, both public sector issues. Our mandate is the public sector at this point. The IPC really has 5 main roles. Principally, we can sort of break these down into the departmental work. Our policy, compliance, and legal departments do research and provide advice on proposed legislation and government programs, and we ensure compliance with the privacy laws. Our tribunal department resolves appeals and deals with privacy complaints. And the other big mandate, and part of the reason that I'm here, is we promote public education in important issues. We have 2 main acts that we're responsible for, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and its municipal counterpart, which came in 3 years later. We are hoping to soon have responsibility for a 3rd act if the government can get one introduced into the House. We had expectations that it might come in this spring, but it's not looking good at this point, so likely the fall. The issue is that if the Ontario government doesn't do something, federal legislation will kick in 2004, and the government of Ontario is never particularly keen on the federal government moving into its jurisdiction, so we're likely to see something soon. The rights that people have under the legislation are really twofold. One, it is providing a right of access to government-held information, and this is by and large general records, not personal information. The other side is access to your own personal information, files that government has on you. You have a right of correction to review those records and to make sure that they are accurate. We have the right to make sure that your information that's being held is being treated properly. But as you know, the landscape, especially in the healthcare area, is changing significantly. The demands on the system are growing. The resources, while growing, don't seem to be growing as quickly as the demands. Our demographics are changing, and there's mounting pressures to use new technology to, in part, address some of these new demands. These are just a few of the reports and commissions and studies that I've found recently. There's probably many others that you're more aware than I am. The Health Infoway recently announced that it was going to build a national registry of health information systems. And based on the data attained through a national survey, it will document electronic health record solutions operating in Canada, again to help end duplication and help expedite the development of these technologies. In Ontario, more specifically, there are a couple initiatives that are really driving a lot of this technology changes. The primary care reform and some incarnation of a smart card to replace the 3 current OHIP cards that are out there. You're probably, if you've been following this Smarter Health series, you're probably quite aware of these initiatives, so I won't dwell on them. One of the things that I will note, though, that the electronic patient record is designed to enhance quality and accessibility of health information and to facilitate communication. But it also has a lot of potential privacy implications. So without taking into account the implications of what you're doing, you can build a very, very expensive system that no one's going to use. The need for privacy has never been more obvious or more pressing. Everyone, I think, acknowledges the sensitivity of health information. Everybody realizes that having differing rules is not helpful, that we are going to be increasingly exchanging information between patients, doctors, clinics, various providers, and that access to information could help save someone's life, but it could also ruin someone's life if used inappropriately. So getting privacy right is key. But what is this privacy thing? Now, privacy, and typically when data protection organizations talk about it, we talk about informational privacy. It's important to understand that information about you is your information. Others may have it, they are custodians of it, but it's not their information to do with as they choose. Personal health information is one of the most sensitive types of information, aside from perhaps financial, that exists. Patient records could contain information about abortions, sexually transmitted disease, mental health, information that is not necessarily pertinent to anyone aside from the clinician that you're dealing with. Specifically, genetic information, DNA, has become the topic. I don't know if any people saw the National Post this morning. There's an article about this fellow Kirk Kerkorian, who is a billionaire, and he's having this thing. He married this very younger woman, and she had a baby, and he claimed it was his because he wanted to appear virile by having a child at age 80. But it's not his, and now she's suing him for $320,000 of support per month. But it turns out that it could be this guy's baby, who could also be the father of Elizabeth Hurley's baby, and she's having him take a paternity test. And as part of the other lawsuit, Mr. Kerkorian apparently sent somebody to steal some DNA from this guy, who's also worth a lot of money too, surprisingly. And apparently they stole some dental floss, and they got DNA from his dental floss. And as part of the affidavit, his lawyers have said that such a theft of personal information, personal health information, violated the last bastion of personal privacy. Non-consensual harvesting and testing of a person's genetic material constitutes more than a severe invasion of privacy. It is a gross violation of an individual's most fundamental private personal information. DNA is not public-private property. It is the most fundamental private essence of a person's being and must be afforded the ultimate protections. Not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars that are involved, but the sentiment is true. So you can see that technology is allowing us to, we talk about biometrics. You lift a little DNA from here, and with the right technology you could find out whether I have a genetic propensity to heart disease. That could be potentially life-saving for me. It could also be potentially career-threatening if the company decides that they don't want to promote me because potentially in 20 years I could have a heart attack.
Drinking comfort.
Just to clarify what these topics are, personal information is information about an identifiable individual. We sometimes talk about personally identifiable information. This is distinct from professional information. your job title, your job address, your job phone number, information about you and your function doing something. Privacy is control, personal control over this information. Confidentiality is control over someone else's. And security is those tools, systems, mechanisms to ensure that you're doing one of the other things. I was thinking about this morning and saying when I went into the washroom and my cat trotted in after me, I wasn't thinking about security. I wasn't thinking about confidentiality. I was thinking about privacy. My cat had other issues. Security is not privacy. This is something that we try and drill into the minds of especially technologists, but also a lot of business people. And I came across this, speaking of cats. This little bird, imagine he was sitting behind a 6-inch plate of plexiglass. He's secure. The cat can't get to him, but he's got no privacy. Security is a subset of privacy. The first 4 issues here are standard issues that are necessary for secure systems. If I'm doing electronic banking, electronic funds transfer, my institution needs to know that it's me. I really, really want my institution to know that it's me. But that's just about security. That's about making things done right. Privacy and data protection are based on the fair information practices. These practices form the basis of data protection legislation. They come out of the OEC guidelines, which were developed back in 1980, were codified into the CSA guidelines, which are now part of the Federal Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. These are the ground underpinnings of any privacy or data protection legislation around the world. And they're not difficult. Things like limiting collection, consent, notice, use limitation. If you collect information for a specific purpose, you can only use it for that specific purpose. If you only need to collect my name and phone number, you don't collect my place of birth and my religious affiliation. It's not necessary. One of the things that we've been talking about to businesses that are trying to get their heads around this is saying a lot of businesses think personal information for customer relations management, all this banks of PI is an asset that can be data mined. It can also be a liability. If somebody breaks into your system and lifts all that information out, there's a great chance that you could be sued either criminally or civilly because you have facilitated a crime if someone has stolen someone's identity by accessing this information. That's no longer an asset. That was a liability. So if you have this information, you have to make sure that you're treating it properly. To move back into the health environment, I was speaking with a colleague a little while ago, and he said, let's talk about the whole origins of what this privacy thing is. We start off with a doctor-patient relationship. We talk about doctor-patient confidentiality. It was really, in the beginning, a doctor and a patient. That's as far as the information went. Doctor had a file, the doctor put the file in the cabinet, that was it. There wasn't a whole lot of necessity for a broader system. But when you get into a more team-based clinical system, when you have other specialists, nurses, other doctors, more data flows, then we move into the area. We've got the Canada Health Act, the Hospitals Act, the Regulated Professions Act, the College of Physicians and Surgeons. We've got a lot more players and a lot more regulation. But now we're moving into the broadest world, health researchers, other medical research, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies. An awful lot of people are using your personal health information to ensure that they're using it properly and appropriately with, all being well, your consent or anonymized. That's why we need to move into this last stage of health privacy legislation. we've been, Justice Creever mentioned this back in 1980. Since the IPC was founded in 1987, we've been saying there should be health privacy legislation. We've had a couple of abortive attempts. Hopefully this next time round, third time lucky, we will actually get it right. In the States, they have soon real health privacy legislation, although, as I'll get to, it's taking a beating as well. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act provides that healthcare providers who engage in electronic transactions and various things protect one's privacy. Under the privacy rule, Americans will have for the first time, and remember there's still some 30 million Americans that have no health care at all, have the right to, when they see a doctor or healthcare provider, be notified of their privacy rights, how their information is going to be used or disclosed, so they can understand this, discuss it, and give their consent. They have the right to access their medical records and have the record corrected. And they also have control over non-routine uses of their medical information. However, it was too good to be true, and since the incumbent at the White House has changed, attitudes towards the policy have changed before it has become formalized. And there seems to be a move afoot to weaken the whole concept of consent to make it easier for data to flow from a doctor to what they call some sort of regulated bodies. The president of the National Coalition on Mental Health Professionals and Consumers said that if this proposal that has been put forward becomes law, all medical records will be treated as if they are government property and not individual property. The scariest thing is you'll never know who has your file or what they're using it for. There's an organization in the States called the Medical Information Bureau that has the medical files of 16 million Americans. And they tell insurers if anyone's ever lied on a medical insurance claim so they can not cover you in the future. There's a tremendous amount of information about health out there, and if supposed health privacy legislation is actually just a cover to allow information to flow, that's not privacy legislation. And that's what we're working to make sure that the Ontario legislation will not be that way. I mentioned earlier the PIPPA, or PIPPA, as they say in Ottawa. This is going to come into effect across the country in areas of provincial jurisdiction in 2004, unless provincial governments bring in what's called substantially similar legislation. Health information is now currently covered, and it will be covered soon, so that's the impetus for Ontario acting. Health information is covered in a variety of provinces. Saskatchewan is still working on bringing theirs into force, but some provinces, say in British Columbia, they are covered by their Public Sector Act. Hospitals are. In Ontario, hospitals are not covered by our legislation. Strangely, things like colleges are covered by the legislation, but universities are not. Politics when they drafted legislation. Anyway, what I was trying to go with that is saying what Ontario is doing is certainly not unique. There are lots and lots of examples of health legislation. There was a guide to the legislation, and the government then realized the guide didn't actually say anything, so they released draft legislation, which an awful lot of people, including our office, which, if anyone wants to download, we make our comments known. The Ontario Medical Association, the Ontario Health Hospital Association, dozens of organizations have pitched in on their views on this. It's our understanding that the government is attempting to make the legislation a little clearer. This legislation will extend the mandate of the IPC to cover everything that it doesn't cover now that's not federal. That includes associations, nonprofits, universities, hospitals, doctors' offices, lawyers. It is better. It's better than Bill 159, which was a health privacy legislation, supposedly. It is based on the CSA code, so we should have a degree of harmonization with the federal legislation. There'll be a single oversight body. And in one of the important changes to 159, the draft that was released for consultation, there was an issue in 159 about directed disclosures. The Minister of Health could direct disclosure of your personal health information for an awful lot of purposes. Under this new legislation, there's a mechanism that for the Ministry of Health to receive health information that it deems necessary for health planning purposes, which is a legitimate purpose, a technical committee and our office would have to review this, and that the information would be provided to a health data institute, which would scrub the data, anonymize it, and only send anonymized information to the Ministry of Health, because that's really all it needs. If it's doing it for health planning purposes, it doesn't need individual files. So things like that are an improvement, and we hope that there will be further improvements that we suggested in the next round. As it was kind of confusing. There was personal information. Yeah?
Just a quick question. What motivated the province to combine both the private sector legislation with the health care legislation? Repeat the question.
The reason the province combined the two, private sector and health, there's probably two answers I could give you. One, that Bill 159 was so poorly received by virtually everybody that I don't think certain forces in the government wanted, or they didn't want another health fiasco. The other issue is that there's a pressing need for private sector legislation to deal with the federal legislation. Whether they should be combined in a single act, not up for us to say. That's the way they chose to go. They could have separated them. The logic of bringing them together, though, isn't such a bad idea. If the concepts, because they're all based on the CSA code, on consent and notice and that sort of thing, are the same, you can have a separate issue just for health care, and it can stand alone within the legislation. I think it could work reasonably well. It didn't appear to work terribly well in the first draft, but I think they're working on trying to make it easier. We'll just see if they accomplish that in the next round. One of the things we did have, the difficulty in working your way through what the responsibilities were, it was awkward in the first version. I think they recognize that. So hopefully it won't seem quite as forced melding the two together the next time round. Whether the government gets the right balance between appropriate and legitimate access to information and the proper protection of privacy, we'll just have to wait and see. We were concerned about uses of PI without consent, about extensive use of regulations. There was something in there, I recall, that for ambulance planning purposes, the ambulance systems could have your medical records, which seemed particularly odd. We were trying to have the scope of regulations reduced, and our office lacked full investigatory powers. So we're hoping that the next version of the bill will address a lot of these issues, and other organizations like the OMA equally have their concerns, some of which we share and some of which we differ on. So that's the context in which we are working. If you're working in this area, if you're working with technology, you can see that technology is creeping into every bit of the healthcare system, from electronic health records, online prescription renewals, telemedicine. The list is increasingly long. And increasingly, there are challenges that the government is facing in getting a healthcare system to use technology effectively, efficiently, and privacy protected. The important thing is to build privacy into the technology from the ground up. And that's both from a legislative perspective and from a policy perspective. One of the things that gets a lot of talk is the electronic health record. But surprisingly, Canadians aren't really that scared about it. PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey in 2001 and found that Canadians were generally amenable to having their information stored on computer networks. 82% of the respondents were somewhat or very willing to have computerized personal health records to give their doctors faster and easier access. And 85% expressed a willingness to permit central storage of their health records so that they could have access to them, see what they were. The creation of electronic patient records poses numerous privacy risks, though. Patient records stored in central server locations are at risk for attack, inappropriate access, just like any other system. Clearly, one of the main concerns is unauthorized disclosure, that the more available electronic information is, the more likely it will be used. I was reading something the other day about how at one hospital a media star had checked into the hospital, and through their audit logs, the hospital administrators realized that dozens and dozens of people in the hospital had logged into that patient's file inappropriately. And thankfully, a number of them were punished and or dismissed. But the point is they probably shouldn't have had access to go in anyway, rather than having a policy that punishes them for doing something that they shouldn't have been able to do. In the California Healthcare Foundation found that 1 in 6 people engages in what they call privacy protective behavior to shield themselves from the misuse of their health information. This could be lying to doctors, providing inaccurate information, doctor hopping, or in the worst case, not seeking medical attention at all due to the risk of, or due to the perceived risk of this information being used inappropriately or it getting out. That people are withdrawing from full participation because they're afraid their healthcare information will fall into the wrong hands and lead to discrimination, loss of benefits, stigma, or unwanted exposure. And there have unfortunately been too many numerous cases of small-town bank manager knows a friend at an insurance company, does a search on everybody with an outstanding mortgage or loan that may have been tested for cancer or heart disease or whatever and calling their loans. I mean, it's just not right. One of the issues that you may have read about was as part of the primary care reform, electronic records, electronic systems are being increasingly used. The Smart Systems for Health was working with some doctors in the Chatham-Kent area. There was some allegations of inappropriate activity. The system was not as robust as it should have been. So our office went in and did a review of it, and you can download the report. We found that what they were doing was essentially what they said they were doing. The trouble with any of these systems is it's very difficult to literally go end to end. And the privacy impact assessment they had done, which was a couple inches thick, only addressed 2/3 of the system. It needs to be extended to end to end. So they're looking at our recommendations, they're adopting our recommendations, they're doing more. But it just shows how difficult it is to get things right. But it also shows, from our perspective, that the participants were very, very willing to do whatever it took to get it right. And that was the most important thing. One of the things that it's important to realize is that legislation is part of the puzzle. Legislation is the necessary underpinning in our view, but it's clearly not the only thing. Legislation only gets you halfway. Alan Greenspan has got a great quote, which I didn't know Alan was really that technological aware, but and also Lawrence Lustig, the whole concept of technology can be used to facilitate communication. We have also been promoting over the last number of years something called privacy-enhancing technologies, technologies to prevent your information from being disclosed. That's a whole separate talk, so I can't go there. Regarding making health privacy work, we really have to think beyond the legislation. To use technology, to build it into the specifications, to minimize the collection and routine use of personally identifiable information when it's not necessary. It's much better, in many cases, to use aggregated, anonymous, or otherwise coded information unless it is absolutely necessary to use personal information. If it's absolutely necessary, then you should be seeking consent from the individuals to use that information. We recognize that in some circumstances, consent is not possible. And in those cases, as the consultation draft of the privacy legislation has, there are significant steps for ethics review boards and research review boards that have to take these questions into account to make sure that what is being proposed and what is being discussed is both legally and ethically appropriate. Whenever possible, encryption should be used, anonymity and pseudonymity, and privacy impacts assessments. I came across some information about our Swedish friends. They, much like the rest of the Scandinavian countries, are putting a real focus on the use of IT in virtually every facet of life. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting about what they were saying was that the patient comes first, and that security and privacy of patient records is not just something that you do after the fact. It is fundamental. They're a leader in using technology, and I think that everyone in Canada, the US, and Europe is looking to each other to see who's got the best practices. One of the things that I've been saying is that you have to build privacy right into the code of the systems that you're designing. The most logical and important thing is to consider is when setting up technological safeguards is that it's far easier to build privacy in at the beginning than as an add-on after the fact. When you design a house, you design it with, power and ducts and plumbing. You do it at the beginning. You don't design a house and then go back and add these things after the fact. One of the important issues in this concept is what we call privacy engineering. We're developing terms you often hear, chief privacy officers or chief privacy architects, people with an understanding of both the legislative necessity and the policy concepts, but also the technical ability to accomplish what you've set out to do. Some of our friends in the Dutch Data Protection Authority have developed some work in privacy engineering. Privacy engineering is a systemic effort to embed privacy-relevant concepts and policies into technical governance and design. It's attempting to use a methodology to build this stuff in rather than just having to have someone around who's got some good ideas. In order to unify privacy engineering with better understanding of risk management concepts, this paper talks about design-embedded privacy risk management, which is a framework developed for the Privacy Incorporated Software Agent Consortium. Lots of stuff there. I can tell more people about it if they want, but there's an incredible amount of work going into these systems to help organizations do what they're trying to do at a very structured way, not a haphazard way. One of the things that our office did with the U.S. Department of Justice was the privacy design principles for integrated justice systems. These systems are looking at everything from the time that someone is arrested in the police station, through the court system, through a penal system, and into a parole system. Data has to flow to individuals throughout that whole system. Only appropriate information, and often importantly, all the important information has to get to specific people at specific times. It's not easy to do. There's an awful lot of players and an awful lot of technology. The government has spent an awful lot of money on it. The private sector partners have spent an awful lot of money. We'll just see in time if they can pull off what they had hoped for. But the important thing is to design the privacy principles into the system from the beginning, and not design a system that you think is a great data flow, but is actually just a conduit for violating people's privacy. Along these lines, the privacy impact assessment is one of the fundamental things that any organization can do when designing a new system or a new policy or a new practice or legislation. It is a way of determining whether these technologies will meet basic privacy requirements. We've worked with organizations to promote PIAs, to use the provincial Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy laws as a benchmark, because these things are just based on fair information practices that I discussed earlier. Oh, sorry, it didn't click. It's not clicking. There we go. In addition to focusing on information management, and a lot of privacy is actually just good information management practices. PIAs look at a broader issue of system architecture and design. It's built on the premise that informed decision-making and the ability to address privacy concerns through effective systems design are dependent on early identification of privacy issues. A PIA takes users through a series of questions to determine the privacy readiness, and the questions are detailed around the stages in a product lifecycle. You have to look at collecting information, using information, and eventually disposing of information. And a lot of companies never get around to the disposing thing. And that, again, comes back to my earlier point that information that's just sitting around isn't necessarily an asset. It could be a very significant liability. The Federal Treasury Board announced recently that PIAs were mandatory now for all new projects. This has been a policy in the Ontario government for a couple of years now. And there was also legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress that called for the implementation of privacy impact assessments, or privacy impact statements. Basically, when any program was initiated, a privacy impact statement would have to be released for public consultation for a 30-day period. The government would then have to, assuming things moved along, address those privacy concerns and issue a final statement. I think that the PIAs can help organizations make more fully aware and fully informed decisions about the systems they're doing and not run into potentially hugely expensive privacy gaps. Expense can be both in terms of time and cost fixing it, and in whether you're a publicly traded company. There have been numerous incidents of companies' stock value dropping precipitously when somebody finds out that its database has been hacked. That sort of bad PR is really not where you want to go. One of the things that our office did a while ago was to design a privacy diagnostic tool. What we did was we took the fair information practices that are in the CSA code and tried to turn them into a form of a series of questions. There is what we we broke it down into basically a questionnaire, and there's a paper-based questionnaire, or you can download the software version. It talks about the objective of the principle, in this case consent, the objective of what the principle is about, the potential risks if you get the principle wrong, how to implement the principle, a series of are you doing these things, yes or no, and a set of best practices that are maybe not absolutely necessary but are good practice and you probably should be doing them. So you can work your way through the workbook, and it's a way of helping you take a sort of privacy pulse of the organization. By scoring well on it doesn't mean that you're going to comply with any specific legislation, although we did base it on the CSA code. CSA code is based on fair information practices. If you score well on the PDT, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to be in greater than lesser compliance with whatever it is that you have to, accounting for sectoral differences and that sort of thing. We've had people from all over the world, from Australia, from the US, from Europe, downloading this and using it. We've got a lot of lawyers who are actually using the tool and having their clients fill it out and say, if you want to be aware of the privacy issues, answer these questions. If you don't know what your company is doing with personal information, then you don't know if you're doing a good job. If you can't talk about the life cycle of someone applying for a credit card and where that information goes, or going to a check-in desk at a hotel or at a medical clinic, if you don't know who has access to that information, how it's used, you're going to be doing a bad job. And again, this is about information management. It's not about legislative compliance. It's about good customer service and good information management. The PDT it's certainly not the ultimate tool, but we found that there wasn't a whole lot of tools for organizations when they wanted to start. They'd all say, oh yeah, this privacy thing, it sounds very sensible, how do we do it? We didn't have a tool to point them to, so created this. If people are interested in this, I advise you to download it, try it. It's very simple. You just click yes or no, and sometimes just asking those questions in your organization is a very useful way. The other good thing is it's useful as a training tool to help people be aware of what privacy questions they should be asking. That's pretty much what I had wanted to say, but what I did also include here is for people that are interested in health-specific privacy matters, there are a tremendous number of resources out there. Coach has a fabulous guide for the protection of health information produced by their Security and Privacy Committee. I think all these slides are going to be on the IFRA website after this, so if you have missed any URLs, you can get them from there. That's Coach. There's the Canadian Health Record Association. Most of this stuff is focused on security rather than privacy, but as I said, to have privacy, you need good security. If you don't have good security, there's no way you're going to have good privacy. So it's an important element as well. The Canadian Institute for Health Information has been doing a lot of work on privacy matters as well. And they have a lot of good documentation. And more of these issues are coalescing around the recognition that to do the health and IT right, you have to get the privacy right. The other thing that you'll find is that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations out there with a specific focus on health information, health informatics, health research, health. No wonder we spend so much money on it. There's all these organizations to go to their conferences. Canadian Institute for Health Research just released some This first one, the selected international legal norms, I don't know is necessarily the world's most gripping read. It's awfully thick and it's very comprehensive. That just came out in December or January. Our friends in the States, while they have interesting views sometimes on privacy, have millions more. The first ones were all Canadian specific. There is just dozens and dozens, and so you probably just want to click on these off the website rather than write them down. But I just wanted to show you that there is, if you want and if you're taking these issues seriously, there is no lack of resources for people to turn to get things right. And again, there are many, many, many more resources and organizations that are privacy specific with a healthcare bent, healthcare organizations with a healthcare bent, IT organizations with a healthcare bent, health IT with a privacy bent. You can come at it from any way around. Even the National Library of Medicine was one that was new to me. But there's just a staggering number of resources. So there's really no reason that people can say, well, I don't know what to do or I don't know where to turn, because there's certainly all the resources possible out there. Last thing I wanted to leave you with was a quote that privacy is not just going to go away. It's not a little fad. And I think that every business, be it medical, be it industrial, commercial, is recognizing that it has to change the way it did business if it wants to stay in business. And that getting privacy right is not only the right thing to do, it's actually good for business. So I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.